Good evening, church. Welcome back. Welcome to Bible study. We've got a lot of exciting things to talk about today. Not just about the laws about food, but how Paul takes something that's kind of an issue of the day and turns it into a philosophical conversation. That's what Paul's really good at doing. And it reminds me of this thing that Pastor Wolfgang says from his days as a bishop, that a lot of times they'd be interviewed and they said, don't interview the question that they're giving you. Like, turn it back to whatever it is that you need to say, right? Like, turn it back to your point. And that's kind of what Paul does here. He takes a little thing for them and then turns it back to what he needs them to do. The people of Corinth, I think, show a lot of what it means to be in a cityscape, what it means to live among a bunch of other people in a culture that's not necessarily religious. And the deeper we get into the study, the more I kind of feel that relates to us, that the world and the time we're living in seems to be about that too. All right, my clock says 6 o'clock, so we're going to begin. Here we go. We are studying 1 Corinthians. Just a little note on the schedule. I started looking ahead at what we were going to do for some of these weeks. By the way, today we were talking about, are French fries bad for you? I'm taking the stance that French fries are bad, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then next week, we're going to talk about the four loves. This is like an all-time lecture. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. It makes its way into every wedding sermon I do, pretty much. And it shows up, and this is 1 Corinthians 13, which is in every wedding that you've ever been to. And the four kinds of love. And that I really hope that you can tune in next week, because that one's going to be really great and important. November the 12th, we're going to talk about resurrection. This is 1 Corinthians 15, which we read at almost every funeral. And what Paul is getting at when he says, not all shall die, but all shall be raised. It's glorious. It's beautiful writing in 1 Corinthians 15, and that's why we say it at funerals a lot. Then what I've decided to do is combine the last two so that we're done before Thanksgiving. It was a little hard because where Thanksgiving was that we were going to do these two in November and then take a week off and then do one in December. I think we can just combine that and make those strong lectures, and we're going to talk about how there is power in weakness and how what Paul wrote 2,000 years ago is still very true, that the power of being humble. I mean, look at Gandhi, look at MLK, look at all of these people who choose nonviolence and the power that shows up there. It's just kind of really beautiful and poetic. So that's the rest of our schedule. Looking forward to spending that time together. And today we're going to talk about fighting and the arguments that happen in the early church. So French fries are bad for you is sort of my way of saying, they're bad for you, and yet they're on every street corner, right? So at what point does what we know to be true, what we know to be good and know to be evil, if you will, I'm using French fries because it's a relatively innocuous way of getting into good and evil. We know they're bad for us. They have almost no nutritional value. They have tons of calories. They're calorie dense in a way that's not helpful for us, right? And then we load them up with sodium, which is also bad for us in that quantity. And we say, okay, these are bad, and then we all eat them because they are delicious, right? Sometimes we even have conversations about who has the best French fries out there, and all it makes us want to do is go get French fries, which might be what you get out of this lecture. You should go get French fries. And isn't that just an interesting moral dilemma? The more we talk about it, the more we want to do the things that are bad. Well, Paul starts his conversation today. And by the way, I'm hoping that you'll be active in the chat today like you were last week. Thank you so much. It makes it such a better experience for everybody, and even for those who watch this live stream way after it's live. 3 days from now, a month from now, a year from now, when my kids look it up because, I don't know, they're bored or something, like 30 years from now, it makes it so much better when you're in the live stream. So please let us know that you're here and comment and ask questions as we go. That makes everything better. So Paul talks a lot about knowledge today, and we're going to talk a lot about knowledge. And his thesis in chapter 8 in verse 1 is knowledge is not really shared by all. He said, the way he phrases it is positive, for we know that knowledge is shared by all. But then he goes into all of the arguments that they're having right now that suggest that it's not. So he says knowledge is shared by all. We know that knowledge is shared by all, that we all agree, and then he lines up all of the ways in which we don't agree. And in the world we're living in right now, where there are a lot of divided people, and we're all in our own feedback loops. I'm guilty of it too. I follow the news sources that reinforce the points that I already feel are true. The points I follow are peer-reviewed and scientifically based and those kinds of things, right? That perhaps others aren't. But I think we all fall into traps of reinforcing the messages that we already have. That's psychologically, neurologically proven to be true. We reinforce what's already there, assimilation versus accommodation. It's a psychological idea. And yet we all call that knowledge. We call the ways we experience the world and the therefores in our brain to be knowledge. And when other people come to different, I'm calling them therefores, but conclusions, we call that opinion. And for Paul, he's claiming that what he's bringing is true knowledge, and that what they were having was sort of a lesser version of knowledge. And that bears out in really interesting ways. So in this conversation, we're talking about food and how you should eat it, and we're also not talking about food and how you should eat it. We're also talking about what it means to follow Jesus and really what it means to be a Christian in a very confusing context, in a secular context, in a capitalistic economic context, in a polytheistic context for them, and in this crazy city-state of Corinth that has all of these travelers and all of these people from all over. And the question that he's meant to answer. So remember, he's writing a letter to the Corinthians. He's writing a letter back to them because they wrote a letter to him. And the question they asked him is, so should we eat food that was sacrificed to Aphrodite? And this is a big deal. This is a big deal in the early church, particularly for the kosher Jews who do not eat things sacrificed to other animals. But the problem is, like all the food in Corinth, all the meat was sacrificed in a temple, one way or the other. In a little bit, I'm going to show you a map of all of the various temples that they had in this one city. They basically had a theater and a marketplace and a bunch of temples. It's like casinos in Las Vegas. They're just everywhere. So the idea that you could go to the marketplace and buy organic, non-GMO, non-sacrificed meat, like that just wasn't going to happen for them. And the world has this collision of their religious upbringing, especially as Jews, who already have a list of clean and unclean animals, and also the fact that they're already eating with the Gentile Christians in Paul's church in Corinth, which is like far enough for them, right? I tell all of the seminarians that I mentor, I think a really good goal for a pastor is to move 1,000 people an inch. And so often, pastors want to move 1 or 2 or 10 people or 30 people a mile, right? But what we really end up doing as pastors is moving people an inch at a time. In fact, I'm formulating a sermon series that I'm sure I'll do someday about like the 7 ways that I want to move you an inch, right? I think that'd be a cool sermon series. Maybe we'll do it someday. I think you'd be pretty tired of hearing me say that phrase. But I think that's a good goal. It's just a good goal for all of us. Okay, how can I move an inch today or this year or at all? And once you realize that motion leads to more motion, right? The snowball effect of lots of things. And so back to this passage, the kosher Jews have already moved an inch. They are already in church with these heathen Gentiles, right? These people that we think are really dumb and gross. They don't have any of our Jewish ancestry. They don't know the book of Daniel or Jeremiah. They don't know anything about nothing. They're complete noobs on everything. And for some reason, Paul's united these people together in a church, and they've already been pushed their inch. So to them, to the Jews, eating meat that's been sacrificed in one of these pagan temples is too far. I've already moved my inch. Thank you very much. I know that it's easy for us to look at other people in their lives and think, oh my gosh, y'all are being really ridiculous. And that's because we are not invested in it. But we all know what it feels like to move an inch and then somebody asks us to move more. You all know. You know what that feels like, right? When your kid's like, oh, okay, what I want to do is paint a wall in my room. And you're like, okay, that's cool. And I want to hang a black light. Wait a second. I already moved an inch, right? I already gave you that. There's a whole book series about if you give a mouse a cookie, right? Like, it's that same thing. And so I want you to put yourself in their shoes for a little bit, okay? Now, you're telling me that I am supposed to raise my ethical standard. I'm supposed to raise the bar for my life and to be a little bit better than society. I'm supposed to focus on Christ and be a new creation every day. But at the same time, you're telling me not to judge all of the people who aren't doing what I'm doing? That's hard to do. And I don't want that to get lost, that these are just some silly sticklers for the rules. These are me and you, right? These problems could be our problems. And what Paul ends up saying, which I find very interesting on a philosophical and a morally ethical religious idea, is the eating of it, the action of it, is not a sin. So just get over it. But what is a sin is if, when you do it, you weaken somebody else's faith. Okay? So he gives 2 scenarios in this chapter. He goes, if you're going to eat it and you're at home and there's nobody there that's going to balk at it, then that's fine. It's eating the meat that's been sacrificed in the temple of Aphrodite is not a sin in of itself. It's just meat, and you know the difference. You know that those gods are fake and that whatever hocus pocus, by the way, that word hocus pocus, right, comes from priests doing the Mass in church in Latin. Did you know that? So Horpus, right, and Corpus Christi, right? So that when they would say Corpus Christi and they would break the bread, that means corpus means body, Christi means Christ, right? Corpus Christi is the body of Christ, and the priest would have his back to you, and he would break this, and he would say, "In nomine Patri, blah blah blah, Corpus Christi," and then he would turn around and he'd be like, "And here's communion," and then the church would be like, "What's that hocus pocus?" Right? That he did. So, like, for these Jewish people, they would already know, look, you know that that's hocus pocus. Like, there's nothing actually happening in their burnt offerings. There's only one God, and what they're doing, just let them do it. Because if you push them too far, if you push them more than an inch, there's going to be tension there also. So he says, if no one's watching, then eat it. But, he says, if other people are watching you who are weaker in the faith than you are, then don't eat it. Because people look up to you. And I think that's really an interesting way to talk about sin. Is sin the action itself, or is sin the repercussion of causing other people to doubt? And Paul's saying in this particular example that the sin is not eating the thing. It's how other people will react in their faith life to God because you messed up. All right? And I would love to engage you all on this conversation. If you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, do you think about sin as an action? Or do you think about sin more as how its repercussions? Okay? I put some up here that I think are interesting. They're not the be-all and end-all. Admittedly, these are pretty tame for what they could be, right? For instance, something not on here is attempted murder. Attempted murder a sin? Right? Is it the action or is it the consequence that's the sin? And Paul is stating here in 1 Corinthians 8 that it's not the action of eating the meat. It's the repercussions of how your actions affect those who have less faith than you. And I've been thinking about that a lot this week. All of those people who watch you, there's always someone watching you. There's always someone who looks up to you. There's always someone that looks to your faith life as a barometer for their own. There's always people who seeing what kind of ethical integrity you have and then applying that to themselves. This is feedback. This is how we find ourselves in the world. And so here's some things. Here's some actions, okay? Getting divorced is an action. Is it a sin? Not recycling. Is it a sin? By the way, I just have to tell you this. As an environmentalist, recycling is the C- work of an environmentalist. Recycling is not great. It is a C- at best. The phrase is reduce, reuse, recycle. A, B grade, C grade. Recycling is the C- work of an environmentalist because it can only be used once. It takes a bunch of energy to collect it. Most of what you put in a recycling bin doesn't actually go anywhere. It'd be much better off if you didn't use the plastic that ended up being recycled anyway, right? And if you did, if you repurpose it and use it for something else. Is not recycling an action that's a sinful action, or is the sin that the recycling doesn't do a whole lot, right? Cheating on your taxes. Is the ethical dilemma that you broke the law of the land, the law of the nation? Or is it that you took money that somebody else could use? Throwing out food. Is the ethical dilemma that you killed an animal or somebody killed an animal so that you could send some of it back or let it spoil in your fridge? Is that an ethical dilemma? And again, is it the action itself or the repercussions that food could have gone to somebody else? Where do you see the sin in that? Never talking about your faith, right? Is that immoral? Is that a sin to not be articulate in one's faith journey? Because clearly, if you don't talk about your faith, then people look to you and say, oh, that's what a Christian is, right? Christians are those people who don't talk about their faith. Alcoholism or even overeating or something like that, is the action a sin, or is the behavior that comes with it, a sin or something like that? Is a sin the action or the repercussion? Justin?
Yeah, no, I think this is a little interesting. We've had a couple people answer in the chat.
Awesome.
Seems few people think it's action, and I was going to put that answer myself. I would think action.
Right. We almost always think it's the action, right? And not necessarily the repercussion. So in that instance, right, attempted murder is still a sin. Even if nothing happened, right? Even if the bomb didn't explode. That's really dark, but, right. That is a very postmodern American idea of sin, right? And I'm not, don't hear me wrong, I'm not saying this is one way or the other. But I'm telling you, we've been instructed, institutionalized, we've been programmed to see sin as the action, right? The thing we do. Are there other comments in there? Or they're on the same wavelength?
No, I'm just laughing. Shout out to Peggy. She said it's also inaction, and I'm kind of laughing because I'm looking at your list, like never talking about your faith and things like that. It's not just the things we do, but the things that we neglect to actually do as well.
Right. The things we do and the things we've left undone, we say in our confession. Yeah. So that brings me to another part of this. And please keep those going, okay? Because this conversation is going to grow a little bit. I might ask the question this way. Are sins individual or corporate? Meaning, is the sin my action or is the sin the society action? Okay? Athena and I started working, we've got a skit for Sunday's sermon, so get excited about that. But one of the ideas we were playing with when we were deciding to write this skit was, is sin individual or corporate? Meaning, is the sin the action or of one person, or is it the brokenness that led to that action, right? Cause and effect. For instance, getting divorced. Is getting divorced the sin of one person? No. Isn't it a relationship? And weren't there other factors involved in that? Maybe somebody worked too much because their boss was too demanding, right? Where is the sin in that? Is there sin in that? Not recycling. By the way, did you know that plastic, man, I did not think I was going to be this environmentally charged today, but here we are. The plastic industry lobbied the government to put the recycling symbol on plastics on the bottom of every piece of plastic so that you thought they were recyclable, even though almost no one takes a 5, right? I looked on the back of my McDonald's cup this morning. There was a 5. 5. No one takes that, right? There are that many numbers that goes up that high, and most places only take a 1 and a 2. And even then, they only take it once, right? Is not recycling, is that an individual sin or a corporate sin? If they didn't package my grapes in plastic, I wouldn't have to make the decision to recycle them, right? So how can I get grapes in any sort of realistic, rational way in our modern world without participating in that culture of throwing things away? Yeah.
Another good comment that was made is with corporate sin, we are guilty by association.
Yes. So we're going to hang on to that because I want to go through this list, right? Because we kind of agreed that each of these was an action that I performed. That was where the guilt lies, right? The buck stops here. But cheating on your taxes, right? Isn't maybe the greater sin that the tax structure oppresses the poorest people and the middle class, right? The idea that I can cheat on my taxes means no one's actually watching me fill out my taxes, and far less than 1% of people are ever even audited, especially not in the middle income tax bracket, which suggests that there is a likelihood that no one will ever find out, and in some ways there's that entrapment, right? And the rules are all so complicated anyway that it's just not easy to do, and so I could be cheating on my taxes without really knowing exactly what I'm doing. Where does the sin lie? The fact that I've been given the opportunity to cheat on my taxes feels like a corporate sin, right? If they just took the right amount out from all of our paychecks to begin with, we wouldn't run into that much. And how much of our taxes, and this is really another deep dive for me, but how much of our taxes are paid through and not paid through loopholes that are written into law to curb our behavior in a certain direction, right? How much of our taxes are like energy credits or, medical and stuff like that to encourage us to live a certain way. And some of that's for our own self, for our own being and for making our lives better, but not all of it. Sometimes there are tax incentives for things that aren't really for us. That's to curb our behavior, right? So where's the ethics in that? Throwing out food, it's not my fault that the restaurant gives me a double portion of the calories I need every single time. There's just not a lot of good ways to not throw out food, particularly if I'm on vacation. You can't order half a plate, right? Never talking about your faith. Well, we make it really difficult to honor another person's faith because we start to think that there's ethics involved and that I'm right and you're wrong. And then again, is the act of overindulgence of drink or food, is that an individual sin or is that a culture that pushes all of those things, right? Every time I think, I'm not going to have a drink tonight, and I sit on the couch and then I turn on the TV and they're drinking on the TV show, right? They're drinking in the commercials. Right? It's really hard to watch football without a beer because every commercial is either a beer commercial or a truck commercial because they know that that's their target audience, right? And they've got this really, you see what I'm saying? So on what level does the buck stop with me, and at what level does the buck stop with the greater community? And to your point, Justin, or Peggy's point, right? It does often feel like it's unavoidable. This is like the whole premise of the show The Good Place, which you should all watch, right? It feels unavoidable, to which we ask the question, is Jesus then sinless? If sin is corporate, is there a way that Jesus lives outside of that corporate sin, right? He says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's, right? He's either paying taxes, if you read the story, I think that's in Mark, about he finds a coin in a fish's mouth and gives it. He's either paying taxes or he ain't. And is there a way that that's not sinful behavior? He's participating in a culture that has slavery in it, and he benefits from that. You're saying Jesus never got a meal that was made on the back of a slave, right? If sin is corporate, is there a way to untangle yourself? Or then do we say that Jesus also has sin? So we're not going to answer all these questions. These questions have been fought over by much more capable people than me over centuries. I mean, all the great writers, Irenaeus and the Arian controversy. Are you reading about these things in church history, Justin? Have you gotten to the Arian controversy in church history? Yeah, he says that's all we're talking about right now. Exactly. So it's this conversation. Where does sin come from? And just remember, Paul says in this particular part of 1 Corinthians that sin is not the action, but the way that draws people away from God. And that shows up in the Gospel of John as well.
We did have a couple more comments.
Yeah, please.
I just want to bring to your attention. Karen said, when talking about sin, I don't want to blame my sin on anyone else but me.
Uh-huh.
And then Valerie said, we are all responsible for our actions. Blaming society for our actions is not accepting responsibility.
Yeah, right. And I think those are really good answers. Those are really good Western, individualized ideas of what sin is. I just want to tell you, that has not been the church's position over the last 2,000 years. We are not always of one mind that sin are my actions. We live in the most individualized culture that has ever existed, right? I'm going to let that sit for a little bit because we're going to come back to it. So what Paul says is, and he wants to be there. He wants to say you should take responsibility for your own actions. But the problem is you're not strong enough for that. He says you are babies in the faith. I tried to give you real food, he says in chapter 3, but you weren't ready for real food. So I nursed you. I gave you the milk of a mother because you aren't strong enough in that faith. And this is the problem with saying that sin is my responsibility, and I don't want to blame anybody. I don't want anybody else to have to bear the burden of my sin. Well, that's what Jesus did, so sorry about that. What's done is done. But at what point do we say this person is incapable of making this decision, and therefore they are incapable of being properly tried for that decision, right? Mental illness becomes an issue. Ability and disability becomes an issue there. Temporary insanity, right, becomes a conversation. Not of sound mind. We have different levels of murder based on whether or not it was premeditated, right? Then when you talk about things like tax law, we say that there are different measures of, is it tax evasion, right? Is it a miscalculation? And the penalty, we always try and make the punishment fit the crime, right? When we talk about divorce, if one person was unfaithful, then that makes the mediation of the divorce and who gets what assets different. We have varying degrees of one sinful level in a divorce proceeding. Did you know that, right? So on the one hand, we want to say, okay, well, I have my actions. And on the other hand, the way we process all of those broken relationships have varying degrees of them, which is really fascinating. And essentially what Paul's saying is, y'all aren't ready to take responsibility for your own sins, your own reactions. He thinks that we all have different measures of faith. And what the Corinthians have is nothing compared to him. I mean, you have to laugh at Paul. Paul's hubris is pretty great sometimes. And I want to read to you, because this is from one of my great commentaries. This is the New Interpreter's Bible. I've got like 20 of these, and they're all huge. And my backpack straps are falling off because I've been lugging those around, getting ready for Bible study. And this is from that book. It says this: for Paul, sin is never simply a private act between an individual and God. Such a wrong relation with God always inevitably spills over and harms others as well. We hear persons say that what they do with their bodies, for example, is their own business and nobody else's. Paul would have none of that. If you harm your body, it affects others in ways you do not imagine. Sin is whatever form is corrosive not only to the individual sinner, but also of those proximate. Paul's notion, therefore, is totally out of joint with modern inclination to privatize not only our relation to God, but also our own moral choices, both good and bad. This is sort of suggesting, and I really like this domino picture here. I love it when the pictures line up. Like when you actually find, you're like, I wonder if there's like a human kicking over dominoes. And you like search for that and you find it. It's great when you make PowerPoints by yourself in your office all alone. Those things make you happy. To be clear, Paul is arguing the exact opposite of what you all are arguing in the chat. He's saying that the sin isn't so much your action as it is the way it harms all those people around you. And in our over-individualized lives, we often undervalue how our actions negatively and positively affect everyone else. And so we say oftentimes, that's their decision. We need to let them do that, right? And, it's, hey, don't judge me, right? We say that all the time, right? That's sort of the mantra of 21st century America. Hey, don't judge me. Don't judge me. I do my own thing, right? But when we fail to interact, when we fail to step in, we deny how much hurt and pain others are causing, okay? So for instance, the restaurant analogy, we should all be lobbying, and the restaurants should all make portions that are appropriate to the diet that human beings need. But they're not going to, right? And so we are caught up in this dilemma where the pendulum on is it corporate sin or individual sin has gotten so far this way that we are harming ourselves and doing nothing about it. Which brings me back to the message, the theme, the title of this particular lecture: French fries are bad for you. But we don't stop each other from eating them, do we? No, we buy them for others. Actually, I was talking to a buddy today and told him that he's feeling bad. I told him I'd go buy him French fries. I actually said that today, now that I think about it. And we're all just hypocrites, you know? Okay, moving on, unless we've got questions on any of that. All right, great. Can you get rid of me and just show this? Good. So this is from my book, and this is what Corinth would look like. And what I was really excited about was, I was going to say, hey, we're going to be there in May. Someday we're going to be there. Someday we're going to stand where this is. This is on our list in Corinth. Okay, in this picture, if you can read it, there's a theater and a market, and then there's the temple to Athena or Apollo. Then there's a fountain, and there's another temple. There's a basilica. There's the bathhouse. There's a statue to Athena. There's the temple to Tyche. There's an unidentified altar. There's a fountain to Poseidon. There's a temple of the imperial cult. There's a pantheon. There's a temple to Aphrodite. There's an unidentified building, temple, ? There's a tavern. There's shops. There's a shrine, right? There's offices. And there's just temples everywhere in the city of Corinth, right? It's like the casinos in Las Vegas. As soon as you stumble out of one, you stumble into one. And so the greater philosophical understanding that Paul is getting at them for is not just about food and not just about sin, but how we relate to the society we live in. Because we are Christians. And we are called to follow Christ, to follow the way of Jesus, which is when we take all of our money and we put it together and we dole out money for widows and orphans. The Christian model is when we gather together for meals, when we care about each other. When we don't care about power, we care about the power of the people. It's a model where we devote ourselves to the one God. We go in one direction altogether. We follow one purpose and one meaning, one creed for our lives. Jesus Christ is Lord. And it's hard to do that if this is your setting. It's hard to follow Jesus when you're right outside the temple of Aphrodite. It's complicated to be a Jewish Christian when all of your meat has been blessed in one of these other temples. It's really odd to praise people for circumcision in the Greek bathhouses where other men aren't circumcised. It's almost impossible to tell your children the stories of Daniel in the lion's den when they have the Greek dramas at the theater. It's really, really hard to be Christian in this world. And I just have to say, my time reading it this week was like, yeah, it is. It really is hard to be a Christian in the world. And let's not move on from that. Let's admit how hard it is to do the right thing. Let's admit how hard it is to confess our sin, both individual and corporate. All the things that we've done and all the things we've left undone. Let's admit how hard it is to get up and watch church on YouTube when we can't be there in person. Let's admit how hard it is to not be annoyed that the person behind us is off key. Let's not admit how hard it is to be generous when Amazon can get anything to my house in 2 days. Or 2 hours. Let's admit how hard it is to follow Jesus, who lived in another time and in another culture when our culture is screaming at us to buy an iPhone 12 Pro. Let's just admit how hard it is sometimes to be a Christian in the world. And by acknowledging that it's hard, we also acknowledge that we can't give up. When I was 13 or 14, my pastor, David Sloop, who's still my pastor, talked to him yesterday. He retired a long time ago, but that still doesn't matter. He still takes my call. God bless him. And I was going through a confirmation interview, and I thought about it this last week because now I do confirmation interviews. And I remember putting on a collared shirt because my mom made me to go to church to talk to the pastor about my interview. And I remember my hands being sweaty. I remember thinking, I'm not ready for this. I remember thinking, what's he going to ask? I remember thinking, I'm going to be great. This is going to be fine. And then I remember thinking, I hope he doesn't ask like what I believe, because that's so hard to say. And I walked into his office, and he had this painting. Can you make this full screen again? This painting, which I hope you can see well on your screen, is a picture of a street in the aisle of a church. And Pastor David, the original PD, asked me, Daniel, what does this picture mean to you? And I just told him everything, right? It means that even though I'm on the street and I feel like I'm out in the world, I'm actually still in church. And even though I feel like I haven't been inside the church, I'm still in God's place. And the whole world is God's sanctuary, and there's no separation of church and state. That's a myth, that we live passionately in both, and that God's got this even when we don't feel like it. And we're praying even when we're just walking down the street. And this picture just meant so much to me. I wanted to share it with you. You can look it up, Scott Mutter, Serrational Images. And I hope that you get some comfort in this too, to know that even when it's hard to be a Christian in the world, when you're passing the temple of Aphrodite and the throne of Poseidon, which is, by the way, one of the things that's on our tour when we go to Corinth, that you realize we're still in God's beautiful creation. All right, I want to use our remaining time to talk a little bit about knowledge. This is the beginning of chapter 8. This is the line. We started with this, and we're coming back around to it. We know that we all possess knowledge. That's what he says, right? But when I told it to you, I said, he's really saying not, right? This is a not joke. We know that we all possess knowledge, not because we don't agree on anything. But knowledge puffs up. Knowledge makes you arrogant, is one translation. Knowledge inflates you, while love builds up. Do you remember in chapter 3, we talked about how you want to create a building for God to live in, right? God's temple is something that you build up. And then later he says, actually, the temple is inside of you. So build yourself up with good elements. And we started with that list of like gold and silver and things. And you're like, yeah, but actually those are terrible for building. And what he really wants is like humble things to build up. He says, don't puff up. Knowledge puffs you up. But love builds up. Those who think they know something don't yet know what they ought to know. This is a play on words. The word knowledge. I didn't even highlight the last one. That's how many of them there were. One snuck past me. There's 5 words. The word knowledge shows up here 5 times. And this is what I want to show you here today. And I called our good friend Dr. Vicki Gallagher's professor of communication at NC State because she teaches on rhetorical theory. And when we go on our tour, she'll be lecturing on the birthplace of democracy and the birthplace of rhetoric and all those things that also happen in Greece. So it's the same place, right? It's got such a story, such a three-dimensional story to tell. And so I was talking with her over the last few weeks as we were, talking about, we nerd out on this stuff together, and then talking about all the different ways of knowing that show up. You ever heard the thing like Eskimos have 13 words for snow or whatever, right? The Greeks have all of these words for knowledge, which is hilarious because we have such a vocabulary. We have such a huge vocabulary, but we actually don't use knowledge in this way. Even the French have 2 words for knowing, right? Je sais, je connais, right? One of them means I know a fact. One of them means I have a relationship, right, with someone, right? You would say I know, Carrie, but I have an intimate knowledge of my neighborhood, right? Well, we don't use a bunch of words for know, but the Greeks definitely did. So doxa is a common knowledge. It shows up in our worship as the doxology, praise God from whom all blessings flow. Sort of a common way of it. This is just things we all know, right? Like the doxology, which we sing, at Thanksgiving and things. Episteme, which is a philosophical knowing. I minored in philosophy in college, and I took a class on epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. And one of our test questions was, how do you know that you know, right? That's epistemology for you in a nutshell. Techne, which is art, right? Like architecture, those kind of things that has that root in it. It's sort of the beauty, the knowledge is beauty, beauty is knowledge, right? Truth is knowledge, truth is beauty, beauty is truth. Pistis, which is also related to epistemology, right? Pistuo is the word that Jesus uses all the time to say, you of little faith, right? That becomes pistuo. It's like a belief. Logos, of course, we know that. That's a Bible word that shows up all over the place, too. It's a rational explanation. It's logic. It's therefore. It's if you studied geometry and had to take the SAT, you remember categorical syllogisms, I took a whole class on logic and just loved it. I just wrote all of those proofs out because it's just wonderful. Charisma actually means grace. I said this to Ashley one time recently. I wish the church could reclaim charisma and not for like the sleazy televangelist, which I am right now. I acknowledge that's a little humorous, but the idea that charisma is actually God's grace. It's not just the attractiveness, right, of the way someone says something. It's the beauty of it. It's grace upon grace. It's when our cup overflows. It's just a gentle joy in our lives. Arit, which would be like erudite, right, is excellence. It's a knowledge of it's like Jeopardy, right? It's like my knowledge is higher than your knowledge, right? I know more than you. And then we get to Gnosis, which of all of these is the least fancy for the Greek philosophers. It's kind of like a spiritual knowing, like I had a spiritual experience, right? And it becomes a really kind of maybe a look down upon word for the Aristotles of the world, right? Because Gnosis is like Gnostic, right? The Gnostics were these early Christians who kind of did all these kind of spiritual party things. It was sort of a lesser form of knowledge, so much so that it couldn't even be proven, right? It's an experiential, it's a spiritual knowledge. It's a knowledge of like, oh, well, I know. Well, how do you know? Because I felt it, right? Yeah. Got a question?
For Gnosis, like when you were talking about Gnosticism, that's where the root of that
That's
comes
the root of the
from?
word Gnosticism, yes.
Thank you.
So the Gnostics do that, and if you've ever heard the phrase the Gnostic Bible, there are a bunch of writings that never made it into our Holy Scripture canon. And actually, my Bible here says the New Oxford Annotated Bible with Apocrypha. Those Apocrypha texts are Gnostic texts, such as I don't have this in here, but the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas. When I write a sermon, I actually consult the Gospel of Thomas often because it'll say it a little bit differently than Matthew and Mark and Luke, who all sort of say the same thing. The only reason Thomas wasn't canonized, as far as we can tell, is we were missing the first page. That's true. Like, we were just missing a little bit of it, and we're like, we have 4. 4's enough, right? 4's enough. And then, fun fact, this guy, I'm not going to pretend to, I think it's Athanasius. He says, well, the reason God gave us 4 is because there's 4 winds, a north, south, and east, and a west. And they're like, okay, that sounds good. That's why there are 4 Gospels in our Bible. But so this idea of gnosis is a spiritual knowledge. And for the Greeks, it was such a lesser knowledge. Look at all the words they've got for knowledge. And this one is like unquantifiable. It's like what happens to you in worship. And because it's unquantifiable, it can't be peer-reviewed. And because it can't be peer-reviewed, it really doesn't fit well into rhetoric. And their whole thing, their whole society was, how can you make something sound gorgeous? And then you have gnosis, which is sort of this spiritual knowledge. Well, Paul turns that on its head. And all of those words, he said, you were a baby in the faith, right? And remember in the beginning, a couple slides back, we all know things, right? Look at that same thing again, knowing that the word is gnosis, a spiritual knowledge. He's actually subverting the ugly stepchild of knowledge and saying that one is actually the most important. So he's subverting the Greek culture as a way of also dismantling the gods that they pray to, right? So he's dismantling their culture because all of this word is gnosis every single time. We know that we all possess knowledge. All of that's gnosis. But knowledge, gnosis, puffs up, while love builds up. Those who think they know something, again, gnosis, don't yet know as they ought to know. So we all experience that we all possess experiences. But experience puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they experience something don't yet experience as they ought to experience, right? Those people who think they have a spiritual life don't. And then he goes on to this last part. But knowledge puffs up. Oh, we got to that part. But at the end, but if a man loves God, he is known by God. So after all of that, using gnosis to say, we all have knowledge, big deal. What really matters is if you have love. Because if you have love, because you'll never know it all. You will never know it all. You'll never know enough to know. You'll never know that you know. You'll never know that you know that you know, right? Knowledge can't get you there. If it could get you there, y'all wouldn't fight about everything, and y'all fight about everything. Saying, but stop inflating yourselves with knowledge. Because if you love God, God will know you. And how much better is that? So again, he's subverting what is weak and what is strong, and making the claim that your life in God is how God knows you. And that word, gnosis, is the same word that God uses in Genesis chapter 2, verse 9, of the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil. It's the same word that later is the intimate relationship between Adam and Eve, right? Adam knew his wife, Gnosis. So the spiritual experience is an intimate relationship with love. So rather than knowledge, he leans into the knowledge of love, if you will, which is also hilarious because philosophy is the love of wisdom, right? But he's saying the knowledge of love, using two different words to talk about the knowledge of God and the love of God. Okay, hope that was good for you. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Been thinking about these confirmation interviews, talking about my confirmation, and then now I'm leading confirmation. And about 7 years ago, I was a young pastor, and I had this kid come up to me in this confirmation interview, and we did it in the sanctuary. This isn't a picture of him, but it's a stock photo, but it's pretty similar to this. I did confirmation interviews in the sanctuary, and we were sitting there, and he starts tearing up, and he's like, "What do I do when I know that people are wrong and they don't listen? What do I do when I know there's sin going on in the world and I can't stop it? What do I do when if people did what I told them to do, their lives would be better and they won't?" And I just said, "Man," we'll call him John. "Man, John, that is the question, isn't it? That is the ethical dilemma." And I said, "Well, listen, let's open our Bibles." You see, here, Paul is saying that if we love people rather than trying to know everything, that we would actually have the knowledge of God. Because the knowledge of God is when you love people unconditionally. And I said this line that kind of stuck with him. And actually, I was on the phone with him maybe 6 months ago. He's a cool dude. He's got Justin's job at a church out there. He runs contemporary worship somewhere, and he watches our services and thinks they're cool. And on the phone 6 months ago or so, he said this back to me. He goes, "Hey, you remember when we had that conversation?" He said, "I've never forgotten that you said it's hard to be smart and kind, but choose kind." So, siblings in Christ, I leave that to you as the closing word tonight. Knowledge puffs up, and you can puff yourself really high up on your high horse, and it will help humanity none at all. You can have all of the knowledge that you think you know, which is all predicated on the principle of the uniformity of nature, if you study philosophy, right? And you can walk around in the world thinking, I can judge you, and I can judge you, and I can judge you. Or you can do as Paul's telling us to do, which is to choose love over knowledge. And in choosing love, we find that our own humbleness, that we don't know it all, and we submit to the one who knows everything. So that's it. That's all I have for you tonight. Thanks so much for coming out to Bible study. Thanks for the people in the room. That helps a lot. And we will see you again next week. Bye now.